Hello and thanks for joining us. Today, organizations are considering what they need to do to develop and enhance their Security Operations Centers, or SOCs. And with me to discuss these issues is Mike Viscuso, who's the CTO and co-founder of Carbon Black. Mike, thanks for joining us. Now, you're also the driver of the company's long-term product strategy. But first, before we get into the meat of the matter, perhaps we could define a term. We're going to be talking a lot about high-speed SOCs. What is a high-speed SOC?
Well, as you already mentioned, a SOC is a Security Operations Center. It's largely manned by humans, with the recognition that technology can't solve all of our problems. They can't prevent all attacks. And so you've augmented your prevention strategy with these humans in the Security Operations Center. When we talk about a high-speed SOC, though, what we're really trying to say is this SOC needs to operate at the same speed as attackers. And I think over the past 2 years, we've seen that ransomware has actually been a big theme. And in fact, within high-speed SOCs, people are thinking that increases the need to respond even faster than they ever have before. Whereas traditionally, a high-speed SOC may be a response time of within 15 minutes or an hour. Ransomware has really driven the requirement down to under a second. So when we define a high-speed SOC, what we're really trying to say is you would need to be able to respond in under a second, which is putting a lot of emphasis on the role of machines in the automation of the SOC processes.
So what's your approach to developing a SOC then? What are the challenges and parameters that people need to be thinking about?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk about any business problem, people will rely on people, process, technology. And I think that's a pretty good framework for any sort of building of a capability within a business. But when you look at your SOC, what we've found over the course of the past several years and over 3,000 customers who have done exactly this is that people, process, and technology doesn't emphasize the role of data enough. So when we talk to these customers, they say, what were you missing when you built your SOC? And they always come back and say, data. We are missing data. We needed more data. And so when looking at building a SOC or a high-speed SOC, we typically say you need to be thinking about data, humans, and machines, which emphasizes the role of data that's not really addressed in people, process, and technology.
So moving on just a step, what is it about endpoint detection and response, or EDR, that makes it essential as a part of a SOC?
Well, certainly, as the two biggest macro trends in IT are mobility and cloud, and that's really increased the role and responsibility of endpoint security software, because now you don't have that network perimeter defending you and your employees. And so as people started to move towards an enhanced endpoint security, they realized that the traditional AV model wasn't really working. It wasn't working because it was prevention only. Which means that when it tried to be more effective, the only thing it could do is prevent more, which led to more false positives and got in the way. And when it did prevent, it didn't give you any context. Like, was this the first step in the attack or the 50th? Okay, and then lastly, it was globally defined. So as CEOs and CISOs were starting to get fired for these breaches, they said, hey, I need much more control over my environment, and they looked to the endpoint to do that. EDR, or endpoint detection and response, is what complements AV in a way that hides these other failures of AV. So it's more than prevention, it's detection and response. It gives you the visibility around any sort of alert, so you know what stage the attack was in, and ultimately allows you to customize your own detection and response plans for your business. So you can address the risk of your CEO differently than someone else in your organization. You can have a different playbook for that computer than you can for another one. And the combination of the traditional prevention model and EDR has given large enterprises across the globe that control that they so desperately needed.
So it sounds like it's sort of centralized and continuous. So I guess that makes it important for investigators and forensic teams?
Oh, you'd be surprised, but again, when you go back to talking to these SOCs, and you say, what is it that really changed your world, right? And they say, oh, it's the data. And when you look specifically at that data from the endpoint, because that's ultimately where the attacker is conducting their operations, they say the biggest differentiator in the data is I can't have snapshots in time, because that just leads to more questions. How did this thing start? What did the attacker do before I got this snapshot? You need to be able to answer those questions. And ultimately, that's what drives the continuous nature of the data collection. But if that data is somewhere else that might not be accessible, well, then it doesn't do me any good. You know, a lot of times our IR partners, when we talk to them, we say, hey, when do you get the call? All right, when do you get the like, oh my goodness, frantic call? And they always tell us it happens on Friday afternoon. We get more calls on Friday afternoon than any other day of the week. And on Friday afternoon, everyone is shutting down their computer. They're going home for the weekend. And so if that data is not centrally stored, you can't conduct your operation. You can't conduct your incident response. And as it relates to SOCs and building a high-speed SOC, that lack of accessibility means that you're waiting minutes, hours, maybe even days to be able to do your job. And that simply doesn't scale with the pace of attackers.
So a SOC essentially has two components though, doesn't it? It's got humans and it's got machinery. So let's talk first of all, what's the role of the humans in all this?
Yeah, this is a great question. So when you have that data, you have this rich, contextual, continuous, and centralized recording. A lot of times I'll talk to prospects and they just want to say, okay, let me put some technology on top of that. Let me have that do the analytics. Let me have that do the machine learning. There's certainly a role for machines. But first and foremost are those humans. Because again, what you're doing is you're taking control of your security program. And your humans are sort of helping you define what it is you're going to do given a certain scenario. They're creating those runbooks for you. When you take control of your security, you're essentially saying, I'm going to do this differently, I'm going to do that differently because that's how I want my security to run. And so humans are really getting the ability to recognize these patterns of attacker behavior instead of just indicators of compromise. They're starting to apply a much more community-centric threat intelligence model, not one that just comes from the vendor. We're seeing a huge community created around this data, and they're starting to say, okay, now I understand the threat. I understand my weaknesses in my environment. I know which are the highest priority. And that ultimately leads me to create a runbook for dealing with particular attacker behavior, dealing with the weaknesses that we have in our environment and addressing them so that you can, in fact, bring in machines.
I'm glad you mentioned machines because we know that machines are getting smarter and they're getting faster. Can we ever do without the humans?
I think there might be a day where we do have enough technology where the role of the human is a bit diminished. We're not there right now. Okay, we do see a lot of emphasis on machine learning, a lot of emphasis on artificial intelligence, and we also participate in that. We've done a lot of great things there. What the role of this machine learning and artificial intelligence is today is surfacing similarities or things that the human should actually process, but still produces a considerable number of false positives. And if you take immediate action on just technology right now, given today's state, you're going to end up with a lot of downtime. And that's why we recommend in the SOCs that we've seen that have gotten to the high-speed stage, they often say, our humans define the runbook, they execute it multiple times, and then they're comfortable driving automated action. There will be a time where the role of the machine actually takes a more prevalent role, but as of right now, when you're defining your high-speed SOC, we often find that the right balance between security and speed and then operational effectiveness, no downtime, is actually to run that playbook multiple times manually and then let the machine do something that you already know you've done multiple times with humans.
So if you had to kind of put a practical spin on this, what do I need to do to develop a high-speed SOC and make it work effectively?
Well, when I talk to prospects, again, they typically come from the angle you just did, which is, okay, what can I buy, right? What can I install? What can I double click and have it all go away? But again, after amassing over 3,000 customers who have built SOCs, we tend to see that the steps are actually quite clear. You first need to focus on the data. You get the data into the system, you get that visibility and allow you to have your humans do their job, right? You're paying a lot of money for these humans. If you don't give them the right data, it's going to be really hard for them to make the right decisions. And so data typically comes first in the high-speed SOCs that we've seen that have been the most effective. Get that data, make sure it's continuous, make sure it's centrally stored, apply your humans to that data so that they can identify how they want to run their runbook. Execute that runbook several times, and then when you've done that several times successfully with no downtime, then you can start to train a machine to do that for you. We typically find that, again, when I go to most of our customers, they say this security talent is super difficult to get a hold of. And so what we're seeing is that people are actually augmenting a really good security expert, like a tier 3 SOC guy, with 2 or maybe even 3 developers that can augment that guy, that can get the data he needs in order to make the right decision, and then ultimately help him automate the pieces that he does routinely. we see that as the best model. It's actually less costly because the developers are less expensive and easier to get. And again, it scales better because that skill set is easier to maintain and acquire than a tier 3 SOC analyst.
Mike, thank you. And final question, wrap up the whole thing for me. If you had a thought you wanted people to go away with, what is it?
Well, I think, again, the biggest thought is that, when I talk to prospects, they typically say, hey, just tell me what to buy, tell me what to install. And just the sense that people are creating SOCs, we're creating SOCs all over the place, is an admission at this current state that prevention of everything is not possible. And that we actually do have a role of the human. And both humans and machines make much better decisions with better data. So when you think about what technology you're going to buy, when you think about what humans you're going to bring into your organization, think about what data you're going to provide those machines, what data you're going to provide those humans. And if you don't have the right data, if you don't have that right visibility, specifically from the endpoint, those machines and those humans are not going to be nearly as effective as they could be.
Sounds good. The humans are still going to have a role. Mike, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for watching.